Hello, good morning. Thank you for joining us today. We're really excited to talk to you as we discuss kind of what it's like to teach UX and discuss what teaching and curriculum in UX is looking like these days in higher education. And collectively, we've learned quite a bit in terms of, over the years, how to share best practices about translating a lot of these concepts from real world settings into learning environments. So that's going to be what we're focusing on today. And also kind of looking at what's changing in terms of, as I said, UX curriculum and what the next generation of developers and designers are kind of going through as they learn a lot of this material. And hopefully we'll also be able to promote some ideas that maybe those of you not in higher education can take with you into your own labs and other settings as well. So I should start out, if I understand how to work this, by introducing, okay, there we go, who we are and why you should bother listening to us. I'll start. My name is Vanessa Hemovich, and I am an associate professor of psychology at the DigiPen Institute of Technology in Redmond, Washington. And I got my start in the UC college system down in Southern California. I've taught all over the US, the University of Washington. Most recently, the last 10 years or so, I've been at DigiPen teaching quite a bit of psychology classes, research methods, statistics, how it applies to neuroscience and UX. And at DigiPen, a lot of what we do is about game design. So I get to talk about this stuff frequently, and it's pretty exciting. So the rest of my panel would like to introduce themselves as well.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Ash. I am an adjunct lecturer at DigiPen Institute of Technology, focusing in mostly user research topics, but also assist with UX classes as well. My background is in games and learning sciences, and also user research and user experience. So right now I'm a user experience designer at Bungie by day and adjunct by night. And yeah, experiencing that and reaching out to the next generation to figure out how we get this into schools and making sure that they incorporate it into their designs early.
Hi, I'm Jami Lukins. I actually graduated from DigiPen Institute of Technology, and I did a lot of the high school, junior high outreach programs there. And then after I was in the industry for a while, I came back and said, you need to train UX designers because we can't hire anyone. And they were like, you should come help us. So I've been teaching at DigiPen for 3 years. And so I am also, by day, a UI UX person at Bungie, and at night I teach UX design.
Hi, I'm Mike Ambinder. I'm an experimental psychologist at Valve. Been there about 10 years. Work on applying knowledge methodologies from psychology to game design, do some data analysis as well, and then play around with hardware. And yeah, always been fascinated by kind of the knowledge that's outside of traditional game design and how it can be incorporated into game design.
So I'm going to kind of kick us off here just by starting with kind of a discussion about what are some expectations that we are seeing and some bias that students are showing in terms of their own perceptions for UX, and how we're also kind of teaching this material, as we like to say in academia, across the curriculum, and how to kind of better prepare people to seek out and prevent problems from happening in UX, particularly in the lab. So I'm going to begin here just by kind of introducing this notion that we are all a mess, we're biased, we have definite perceptions about what we think is right and best and what might be wrong. And I'm going to kind of open with the student perspective here. And one thing that I've noticed over the years is that there's an initial kind of lack of awareness, which maybe isn't too terribly surprising here from students, about kind of what happens in a UX lab. So when is instrumentation tested, and by whom, and how often, what happens to the data, who sees the data, who analyzes the data. So we spend a lot of time kind of breaking that down. And then in addition, and by the way, naturally the answers to those questions are kind of varied as the labs that we could be looking at. So another thing that has come up is that scientific research terms are often used interchangeably with a lot of UX, we'll call it jargon, and vice versa. And personally, I think this is something that maybe we should work towards resolving eventually, but that might be a talk for another day. But something like a design validation, that is a psychological term for validity testing. And so there's sometimes we're speaking two different languages and coming to kind of a common ground here can be a challenge as well. Because increasingly, as students are entering college and they're leaning more towards UX, one thing personally that I'm finding is that they're picking up a lot of jargon as they go. And that can be a good thing and kind of a bad thing. So we have to start initially sometimes by really clarifying what some of the terminology is. And also, there can be some initial difficulty with scope. And again, from the student perspective, maybe this isn't too surprising, but not understanding really what time and energy and resources and how to run a lab, what all of that involves, can be a good point of discussion, because sometimes even when we're underscoping, that can lead to its own host of problems as well. So I'm going to walk us through some things that I do in my classes to help students and people in general just kind of figure out what UX is and how it kind of shows up, particularly in the lab. So one thing that takes quite a bit of time for me to go through, and given the time that I have today, I'll try to be succinct here, is kind of what happens in a UX lab when things go awry. And a lot of times people don't learn until it's too late, so I like to prepare my students as well as I possibly can. And one of these is bias and error. So really this boils down into one of two pipelines. And in a nutshell, with something like systematic error, it's not considered something that's random. It is kind of pervasive in the lab. It could be represented as bias, but it will tend to replicate. So this is a really bad survey that you've created. Or it could be that the Tobii eye tracking software repeatedly crashes. There's something kind of wonky with the instrumentation perhaps. And maybe you just have poorly trained staff or inexperienced staff. So this type of error does tend to show up repeatedly. So someone who's not trained to deal with people in a lab could repeatedly be causing grief amongst people that come in for testing. And if we're systematically causing problems, that can lead to poor precision, which is not unexpected. Random error is a little bit different. It's harder to predict because it's random. So potentially speaking, due to chance or maybe a misrecording, a person in the lab coming in for testing is asked a question and they say 1, and the person recording that data hears none. And that's just kind of a misfire. It does occur. Maybe these subjects are just super stressed that day, or they're tired, so they under or overperform. These are chance events, and it tends to not replicate very well because we don't really see it coming, and also contributes to poor precision. So the good news is that with this type of error, it does tend to cancel out across groups statistically, which is fantastic, and that's why we always like to have a large N or a large number of people in the lab. But systematic error will kind of stick with you like a bad meal, and it is, as I said, fairly pervasive. So ideally, in our UX lab, what we aim for is a good degree of replicability. So a ruler is a nice way to summarize this. A ruler made out of metal or wood is consistently going to measure 4 centimeters across the board, and we can have kind of faith in that instrument. And we also want precision. It's also very important. Are we measuring what we think we're measuring? And one thing that my students quickly learn is the data is only as good as the instruments that are used to collect it, and we're very biased because a lot of times we think we have a handle on this when in fact we really don't. And bias is actually one of the most common forms of methodological issues that we find in science, and it will show up in the design, the implementation, the analysis of the data. It really can cause a lot of problems. So in my classes, I like to have my students kind of work through these terms and give them a chance to practice. I'll throw this question to the audience, so through a show of hands, do we have systematic or random error here with playtesting occurring at the peak of flu season, and we have people that are performing extraordinarily poorly? So show of hands, systematic error, random error. In science, we would consider this to be random error. Good job. And for the rest of you, I guess, keep paying attention. So what happens is that we can't control for this. But what we can do is have a high number of N, or enough people in the lab to come through. If you only have 10 people show up and 3 of them are sick, that can be a problem. If you have 1,000 people show up and 100 of them are sick, that's not statistically as damaging to some of the analyses or some of the data that you might be gathering here. So I have another question here for you, and we have an exit survey that's administered to players after the testing session. Several questions are difficult for participants to understand. So systematic error, random error. Oh, look at that. You all get an A. Very, very nice. So this is something that, as I said, and I think you can kind of see the point here, is fairly pervasive. And this is actually referred to as measurement bias, which is a huge issue in the sciences. And it can lead to attrition in the lab, not due to something that you are actually collecting data on, which is a big, big problem. And if, as an example, if all participants are scoring low or 0, or they're skipping questions about a skill tree, on paper, it looks like they don't care about that thing. But really what might be happening here through systematic error is that you are perpetually pissing them off, making them confused, and when participants feel uncomfortable in any way, shape, or form, they tend to skip these types of questions, or they just mark 0. So we have a huge problem here. And it is something that my students really enjoy practicing and learning about, because when these happen in the lab, a lot of times it's too late, and it can cause a variety of problems. So here's another sort of pop quiz here. Recruiting gamers with significant knowledge about the franchise and bringing them into the lab for user testing. This is an interesting one. Systematic error or random? It's an interesting question. We tend to classify it as systematic error. It's a form of selection bias. So sometimes in the UX lab, we want people who are familiar with the franchise to come in, and they can produce really good, really rich and valuable data. But the point that I want to make here is that it lends its own type of bias to your lab. Because these experienced players, they come in and they come through the door with their own preconceived ideas and notions and expectations, and it's a form of bias that really can skew the data. So the important sort of point to underscore here is that you have to be prepared for this. And is selection bias in this context necessarily a deal breaker? I don't think so, but just be aware that there is a lot of bias that is sort of entering into your lab. Now, as we sort of transition to what the rest of the panel wants to talk about today, we're going to be looking at some other best practices and methodologies, and I just want to sort of wrap up my section here by talking for a second about surveys. And surveys design is notoriously difficult to do correctly, and as I mentioned earlier, the data is only as good as the instrumentation you've got to collect it. And if you have a bad survey, it can be a deal breaker because it is creating so many issues with inaccuracies and misleading data. And as I said, players, if they don't like or are uncomfortable or are confused, they will not finish that survey. So not only are you not getting any data, you're getting also bad user data. The worst offenders by far are the double-barreled, triple-barreled, quadruple-barreled questions, anything that's unclear. I like to run my students through what's called a bad survey activity so that they get to deconstruct survey questions, and it's really, really good practice to learn about how to sort of tinker with this area of UX. So here's an example. Did you enjoy the visual and audio effects in this game? And as I said, this is a tricky thing to do. Here we're asking 2 questions at once, and how does the subject answer this? And I will tell you, they don't, is what happens. So fortunately for us, the answer is fairly easy. We just parse this out, and we ask 2 questions where it's appropriate. How about this question? What was the underwater level? Whoops, small typo there. Too difficult. Well, I think I have it correct on the next slide. There we go. So this is the winner of the coveted Golden Toilet Award for what I hope are obvious reasons here. We have a question that is both leading and vague. So it's leading in the sense that it implies that people have found difficulty with this level. And it actually will skew participant responses. And it's a very subtle thing. But with a good survey, you really should not be able to read between the lines. And here, if I stare at this long enough, I get an idea about what the people asking this question are after. And that's not what we want. It's also vague in the sense that if they agree, what have you just learned? So what was too difficult, and why, and how? So this construct isn't really being tapped in a way that gives us really good information. So we could do a number of things here. A possible solution is to simply throw it into a Likert scale, but this has another set of challenges in UX, because not only do we need to have an appropriate scale, and this one is just an example. You can have Likerts range from 0 to 7, low to high. It could be the attitude anchors are on opposite ends of the spectrum here. But labeling this thing can also be difficult as well. I've seen somewhat rather easy or extremely difficult, very extremely difficult. So people really need to practice what it means to create a good survey instrument, because it is, as I said, notoriously difficult and challenging to do. And this isn't to say that we can't learn these skills, but my students really do enjoy the opportunity to do so. And as sort of a last question, oops, here, there we go. I'll go back. Was web-based UI, oops, we're having some technical difficulties here. Was web-based UI a factor in choosing to purchase this game skin? Well, what are the odds that the participants in your UX lab are going to know what web-based UI is? So we get kind of suckered into our own knowledge base sometimes in terms of thinking that we think that it's explained clearly, but sometimes we really do have to spell things out, and were web-based elements playing a role here? Could be one way to kind of dance around that. It's simple, it's direct, it's to the point. I guess I would give this a B, except that I made it, so I guess I'll give it an A minus. It's not the best question. There are some ways to work around it. So I'm running out of time here, so I'll transition over to the rest of the panel, and then we'll get some more of the discussion going.
So we covered a lot of survey design. So the students at DigiPen have a unique experience in that they have 3 different courses that they can take to get a perspective and a deeper understanding. So for example, they have psychology courses, they have UX courses, and they have UR courses that all help kind of define and narrow into those focus areas. And it's really interesting to see how that's evolved even over the last year, to showing how students across our classes will get a deeper understanding. So that's been super exciting to see that we overlap, but not in a bad way, because it just means that we're able to build on prior knowledge already. So what I'm going to talk about is, once they've done the survey and they've got the results, what do you do next? So one of the classes I teach is data visualization. And it's supposed to be kind of like the second part after you take UX and UR-based intro classes. So a lot of the students have a difficulty at the end of the user research intro course. They have to write a study, and a lot of them struggle with how to write up the results section. They can get a bunch of data, write a good method. They've seen all that in science classes before, but then how do you actually produce the results for that? So one question in the audience, how many of you have just like a press start to create your end of your report, your analysis, right? Like, you just can't press a button and get all of the data put out in a way that makes sense to the designer. So we walk them through the different parts of presenting your data. So first of all, you set out the basics, right? A lot of times they'll just go to Google Docs, they'll say, yeah, export report, and then they'll give that to you. And it's like, no, that's not exactly the best way, because you don't understand what you're giving to players. You don't understand what you're going to present to the designers in terms of the information, the graphs that you use, things like that. So we really want to pull it back and explain, how can you analyze the results that you've got? So we go into understanding your audience and your medium in terms of understanding how are you going to present it? Is it going to be something that a presentation you walk people through? Is it going to be something that you hand them as a paper report? Is it something that you expect them to read on their own? All of this depends upon how much information you provide at a given time, and also the amount of information and the display of it. Like, sometimes you'll want more of an infographic compared to having a graph and things like that. So we back it up, kind of start with the basics. We also talk about things like visual variables. How can you change up how you present the data in subtle ways to help present your information? We also cover different types of charts. So we go through each individual type of chart that's out there. Maybe not all of them, but we cover the majority that are on this graph right here. And then how do you make that decision? What's out there? A lot of them haven't seen some of the examples that are shown. So like, they're histograms, bar charts, pie graphs. They're like, yes, pie charts. I love pie charts. And I'm like, no, like, there's more out there that can do better for what you're presenting your data. So that's something that I try to walk them through, is like, when is it appropriate to use a pie chart, and when is it appropriate to take that data and present it in a better way to be informative to your designers, or maybe even add more information, combine the data sets together to provide more meaningful information. But what I have heard is this is really useful for students to get, because a lot of times people ask them, well, just make a chart, and they're like, no, I know how to find the information or find out which chart I need to use. So providing them the resources and kind of the knowledge of what's out there has allowed them to take it further and dive deeper in their other classes. So this is an example of how I walk them through, like, here's how you can improve a chart. So I start with a small data set that's easily accessible. So for example, Olympic, Summer Games, medals, I forget which, and 2004, 2008, 2012, and 2016. So something easily everyone pays attention to during this time. I do a basic chart, and then I'm like, well, what if we change some things? Like, you got to add labels, right? You can't have a chart without labels. That's just wrong. So add the labels to it, and then show them what else can I do to this chart. Let's add some color. Maybe not the best colors, but it's representative of what the information is. It's gold, silver, and bronze. So making it a little more contextual. Then I walk them through, like, well, try a different type of chart. Don't just stick with the one that you're given right away. How else can you display this information? So let's do a stacked bar chart. And then, well, does it make sense to have bronze on top? Usually you expect gold to be on top and then silver and then bronze. So maybe change the way the information is displayed on the chart and get comfortable with moving around the information. And then try different things. Because we're not presenting to an audience and it's them kind of getting comfortable with working with data, it's about having them try different things and seeing how they can evaluate what works best in conveying the information that they're trying to do. So with that, we also expose them to different tools. For example, start with Excel because everyone's so familiar with it. Have them do some charts in there, and then take them to other types of displays. So we move to larger data sets a lot of times for Tableau and R to be like, which tool do you want to use depending upon which data set you receive. So we move to larger data sets like Pew Research, and also Ubisoft has the Velvet Shell Data Peak series, which is awesome. They get to download and actually look at data from a real game. So that's Rainbow Six Siege is the game that they've exported large data sets to, which is super exciting to the students. So throughout that process, it's kind of an evolution of them learning and building upon the skills they have previously. And since they've already written a report once, usually in small data set form for the user research class, this class really dives deeper and allows them to understand, if I am going to take on this role of user researcher on a team, how do I present the data better and kind of explore it. The other thing that I really try to key in on, doesn't always hit home, is there's certain structure that you can give to your reports that really help convey the point. For some reason, this doesn't stick as well as I'd like it to. It's like, all right, just stick to the point that you have X out of Y participants, and then describe your finding, show a picture, and then a description of what went wrong, provide some more information. Somehow, students really just want to write paragraphs, which isn't that engaging. But hopefully, the more we expose them to reports, the more we expose them to having to share information, the more they'll understand. Like, it helps sometimes to get reports out there faster if you have a system that works well and makes sense and they know how to read it. So that's something we go forward with too. And what's really exciting is that more classes are starting to take advantage of the fact that they know students are going through these classes and starting to integrate it into their own. So the next thing we're going to talk about is going outside, looking at outside resources and disciplines. And I think Mike's going to take it here.
All right. I'll speak on this side of the room because we love you guys just as much as we do the right side. So I guess when I think about what I do as a game designer or a user researcher or as an applied psychologist, a common theme, or at least a common way I think of defining my work is to think about solving problems. That's really all we're trying to do as game designers, as researchers, as experienced designers, is that we have a goal in mind, and sometimes that goal is easy to achieve, sometimes that goal is difficult to achieve. But it's essentially a problem what we're trying to solve. And one really cool thing about the world and science and knowledge is that lots of people have solved lots of problems outside of game design in a wide array of disciplines. There are lots of things we do inside of games that are unique to games, and that's great and wonderful and magical. But there are lots of things that can be applied from disciplines outside of games that will come in handy. And so it's incredibly useful to say, okay, I have this problem, something I'm trying to do inside of a game. As Carlos was talking earlier about reducing disruptive behaviors, right? So, lots of people have studied in psychology and other disciplines outside of games why disruptive behaviors occur and how we might address them or ameliorate them. So lots of knowledge in psychology about how to do this. Think about matchmaking. How do you assess skill in a competitive environment and match players of equal skill, right? This is a problem that is not unique to games. It happens in every competitive sport. It happens in chess. It happens in pool. It happens in darts. And so, the algorithms we use for matchmaking in games, it's a variant of the ELO algorithm they use in chess, right? It's been around forever. It's a really useful way of kind of assessing skill and taking a population of players and determining how they, I guess, are ranked compared to one another. Every matchmaking algorithm we use in games, it's essentially just a modified variant of what they did in chess and have been doing for 50, 60 years. So it's just an example, right, of a problem that we could solve, by using knowledge outside of games and bringing it into something that we'd like to do, I guess, in our current work. So I think about this often. The reason I got hired at Valve was I have a background in psychology. I thought about ways psychology could be applied to game design. I went to Valve, gave them a presentation, and they were like, yeah, here are interesting things from a discipline we haven't thought about that could be useful to the things we're trying to do here. And I've been there for 10 years and get to do something I love. So the way I kind of approach bringing in knowledge from external disciplines are just to think about anything that's interesting that I've noticed outside of games. And I'm like, how could this be applied to what's happening inside of a game? Or what's a problem I've tried to solve outside of a game? And how could this be applicable to what I'm currently working on? Like toxic behavior is a gigantic issue in gaming these days. And we can build up a bunch of knowledge about ways to solve that inside of games. Let's make use of what psychologists have found out outside of games and do that. And so examples are, right, like reasons toxicity exists, right, are anonymity, what's known as psychological distance, right? Like if I'm in person, I'm much more likely to be, or less likely to be aggressive than if I'm communicating with you on the internet. Lack of positive exemplars, people modeling good behavior, not having tight feedback loops, not having consequences tied very directly to actions. Having social norms that are inherited from a previously toxic group, right? These are all findings from psychology that you could look at and be like, okay, how can we make use of this inside of a game to reduce reduce disruptive behavior and/or increase pro-social behavior? So I kind of already kind of addressed this a little bit, and I know we're a little bit strapped for time, so I might jump through these slides a little bit. I want to make the point that I'm saying, okay, yeah, great. There's a bunch of knowledge out there. It's wonderful. We can apply it to games, but obviously we have constraints inside of games, and so like it's useful for me to say, okay, I have this idea, this finding from psychology that could be applied to games to reduce toxicity. Maybe some of the things that I'm looking at are actually not suited for games, right? Maybe the finding I'm looking at is something that only works with in-person interactions, right? It's just one made-up example, right? And so it's important to say, okay, here's a problem that was solved, or at least was attempted to be solved outside of games, and we're trying to bring it into a game, understand kind of what parts can be adapted and what parts cannot. It's just a useful exercise to go through. And again, where are you going to draw this knowledge from, right? Like I listed 5 disciplines here, right? Like the answer is from everywhere, right? Architecture has a bunch of thought put into how buildings are designed, right? And that informs art and informs level design and what we could, the kinds of experiences and navigation patterns that we could be doing in our games, right? I'll make up an example on the spot right now. Think about law. And how justice is kind of, I guess, determined or assigned as a consequence for a violation of social norms, right? Maybe there is an interesting game design to be kind of made from the Code of Hammurabi, which is where the eye for an eye comes from, right? It's like, I don't know. I mean, I'm making this up on the spot. Maybe it's really bad, but just trying to think about, okay, like there are, systems and systems of knowledge and social systems and human creations that were meant for, I guess, addressing one problem in society or solving one problem in society, and all that knowledge and experience can be used inside of games and can do really interesting things inside of games. And so it's just a really fun, I guess, way of thinking about the world of saying I do this one thing, game design, but there is this whole wealth of knowledge that could be applied to what I do. So yeah, I think Jen has some more too.
So in regards to how maybe this can be used in classroom examples, I mentioned I used Pew before, but I wanted to go into a little bit more detail as to why that's a good example of what I've used before. So a lot of times game studios have strict NDAs, so it's really hard to get large data sets to give to students that use real data. But Pew is actually really interesting because they have a ton. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Pew, the Pew Research. Okay, so a good number, sweet. So the just to go in a little detail about that, is that it has a lot of resources that you can give to students that cover a variety of different topics, but still can relate to them. So a lot of it's technology and gaming and social media that can all relate to what they're interested in building in a game. Also, you can see how examples of how to do a report and different ways of showing that information, which is a great way to just get them exposed to reading professionally developed aspects of how do you present this information if you've got a big chart of it. And then they can actually download the data sets themselves and see how it's presented. So you can talk about how do they collect this data? What are the biases in the collection process of this, of the sampling? Then you can go into like, well, now you have to figure out how to clean this data. They give you a data set, but they don't tell you, like it's not put in terms that you can easily understand. It's all coded because that's how you get results for a survey. So how do you make the data understandable to players or to users in this case in a way that you can present it and make it understandable? So they have to go through the whole process of understanding how the data is collected, understanding getting a data set from somewhere, and then being able to make it into meaningful information and what tools that allow them to do that. And then they can also observe how someone else has already done that. So it runs the gambit on how what a good example of writing reports and using data is. The other group is the Nielsen Norman group. As everyone's familiar with, I'm sure, the 10 usability heuristics for interface design. It's a great way to get students observant of how to run heuristic evaluations on games. It's a good start, but they also have a ton of other resources out there. So it's a good resource to not only give students, but also explain to them as to what's out there in terms of user research methods, and then dive into, let's use one now in the classroom. So it's really useful to be like, all right, yes, it comes from psychology. Yes, it comes from web and mobile. Yes, it comes from IT. But at the same time, you can use that. It's fine. Please steal from other industries that have done it, researched it, and done it better, and done it for years, whereas we're just learning and applying it in a lot of ways. The other thing that's really interesting is politics, less so right now, but at the time when the elections were going on, it was really interesting to see all the graphs that were coming out there and be like, wow, that was an interesting way of putting that, or maybe you could have done it better. But like there was a lot of different information. So this one is probably hard to read from a distance, but there's a ton of different methods being used to convey information in this chart. And it's an interesting way to show like you have a lot at your fingertips. Which ones do you use? How meaningful is it? Break down, like, do you understand what those gray boxes are at the bottom? That's a good question, right? Like they've managed to display a bunch in different locations. So this was on a website or in a newspaper. So like it's interesting to find out how other industries display information and use different graph types, and getting them exposed to seeing it in the real world and being like, how can I use that to display the information I need to tell my designers? Sports is also a good one. I mean, obviously it's very related to gaming, but like how do they use heat maps? How do they make it accessible to the public? You'll see this on a bunch of like ESPN and stuff. What are they using that maybe we can use in our testing and user research methods to understand what the player's doing? It looks just like a player navigation map. Like it's really close. So taking inspiration from other industries when you're not at work can sometimes help you create better work. So the next thing we're going to talk about is framing and how to present information.
Yeah, I'm going to go pretty quick because I think we're running up on time. I guess when you're speaking to somebody who doesn't have a background in whatever discipline it is, for me, psychology, you're an artist or you're a lawyer or architecture or whatnot, it can be tough to convince people that this knowledge I have that is not directly relevant to you is actually directly relevant to you. And so when thinking about the best ways to do that, I follow this really simple framework. I have a specific goal, right? We both share this goal. We might try and solve it or attempt to solve this from different angles, but we have the same goal. We want to, again, I'll pick on the same example I've been using. We want to reduce disruptive behavior, right? And so you're speaking to a game designer who may have their own notions about how to accomplish that, and I, as a psychologist, might have my own notions about how to accomplish that. We have the same goal, and so you start from there, and then operationalize it with what you're trying to accomplish, and then you can, it's really easy to bring the conversation to, well, here's the same goal, but it's how has it been solved or accomplished or pursued or investigated or researched outside of games. So here's a way of solving a problem that we have, but that has been done somewhere else. And so if you can make that connection, if you can say, here is a problem I am trying to solve, and here is a way it has been solved, then it can become easy to convince people that, you know, of the benefits of knowledge kind of outside of their primary domain. Because most of us, I won't speak for, or I guess assert too much, but in general, we have a primary thing that we're good at, and then we dabble in other fields. And so understanding that other fields have a wide array of knowledge that could be useful, at least as somebody who is trying to convey that to folks, I guess it's not, it ends up being, I think I'm kind of stumbling over my words, but the point I wanted to make is that for folks who don't have specialized knowledge outside their primary domain, it can be kind of refreshing or encouraging to understand that problems that seem difficult or that people are trying to solve have actually been attacked, and that I, as an outside expert, or you, as an outside expert, actually do possess a way of solving a problem that the person you're speaking to does not possess. And it's a pretty nice and pretty useful feeling. The way to kind of, I guess, go about doing this, though, is not to just speak in broad generalities. I don't think any of us would make that assertion, but it often happens where you might think, oh, okay, I'm, you know, great at architecture, and so I can design great buildings, and so that's fine and perhaps true. The way to persuade people to your cause is to have a concrete application of an external knowledge. So we have disruptive behavior. We think it's because of the lack of, or the existence of anonymity in our game design. So we're going to reduce the anonymity in this way, and this is how we're going to apply this hypothesis to this domain. It's an application of external knowledge to solve a problem, and it's a very specific example. If you can do that and say, yeah, psychology can help in this way, or architecture can help in this way, or art can help in this way, or law can help in this way, and have these explicit examples, then it becomes easy or it can become easier to, I guess, bring people to your cause and to say, yeah, here's a novel way of solving a problem that might sound weird, but it's worked somewhere else, and we believe it would work here. So finally, yeah, we'll get to the end of it.
I will not be rushed. So you have all this data, and you're trying to figure out how to apply it. Students really like getting data and really like making charts and all that, but as soon as they get to the game design, they immediately forget that they've done all that stuff, and they just start making the game that they want to make. So my job, as in the introductory UX course at DigiPen, is to try to help students realize who their target audience is and to design for that target audience and not forget about the research phase when they get to the design phase of their process. So who's it for? I always tell them your target audience is not you. And even if you are in the target demographic, you need to realize that even as an individual in that target demographic, you're going to have preferences that don't necessarily represent the rest of the demographic. So it's important. I always tell them game devs are weirdos, and we make up a very small portion of the world, and it's important for us to kind of broaden our perspective because we're a very small community. Students forget to check from the audience perspective when they're designing. They'll look at something, they'll look at two designs and be like, well, I like this one better. And they'll forget to check in with their research to see what data is supporting that. And they oftentimes have a hard time predicting audience preferences, which who can really blame them? It's really difficult. So we do a few fun exercises to kind of help them out. And you guys don't need to have a group of students. You could have a group of game designers that aren't good at designing for your target audience and do this with them instead to try to get them to start thinking outside their head. So I do this exercise called an empathy map exercise right at the beginning of class, where I have all my class come in, I have them kind of team up, I make them do like a BuzzFeed quiz and like group them up by it. It's fun. And then I have them pick somebody in the class and try to predict what that person thinks, feels, does, and says about a topic they don't know about. So they have to pick someone, they have to pick a topic they don't know that person's opinion of, and as a group they have to try to figure out what this person feels about that, either based off of brief previous interactions they've had, or even just judging them by the fact that they're going to the school, they're in this class, and they have that backpack or whatever. And so they try role-playing as that person, thinking about it. Then they bring that person over and they see how accurate their predictions were. So it's a fun icebreaker because everyone gets to learn something about someone that's in the class that they're going to be working with for the next semester. And it also helps them get in the mindset of trying to imagine the world from this other person's perspective. So what I have my students do is go out and gather data in a way that would make the rest of this panel cringe. And then I have them build what personas, as I'm sure most of you are familiar with, to represent that data. Because it's a lot easier for a game designer to think about Bob, the primary persona, as opposed to a graph or a cloud of data that supports that design decision. So once I have them build these personas, and I make them think of it like a D&D character that they've crafted, or make them think about it like a character they're playing in a play. If you liken it to like being a role-playing game character, it kind of makes it easier for them to imagine themselves with that person and role-play as that person. So I have them loop back multiple times throughout the design process in my class. So when I have them build their UX design pillars, I'm like, explain to me how these pillars match your personas, which are built off of your data sets. When they're doing wireframing, I'm like, tell me how this is still appealing to your personas. When I have them do their prototyping, same deal. And even down to the aesthetics, like, okay, you have these like really bro-y dudes who are all football players and stuff, and you've chosen like a flower rainbow like aesthetic, like, that's interesting. Tell me about what drove that design decision. So then I have them do a final presentation where they present their golden path through through their prototype for a game, a fake game in my class. And I actually try to encourage them to role play as their persona as they're walking through their golden path. So they're like, this is my primary persona, this is who's going through the game today. So I just got home from work and I have 5 minutes to play my phone game, and I decided I wanted to check the PvP rankings because I want to make sure I didn't lose a ranking during the day. And so basically have them talk through what their personas are thinking and feeling as they're playing their game. I want them to justify their design decisions based off of their personas. Tell me how they changed things. Tell me like what preconceived notions that they had to get over in order to come up with a successful design that's designed for this set of personas. And I want them to think of success as measured by satisfying their target audience, not by satisfying themselves. So final thoughts. Who's doing that?
So we were just going to kind of go down the row here and just kind of give some of our perspectives, what we're seeing on the educational side in terms of what are we seeing in teaching UX. And I'll just open it by saying that students 5 years ago, they would interrupt me, and as I was talking about UX on the first day of class, they would say, what is UX? I need you to define that term. And now they walk into classrooms and they know UX, UI, UR, AR, VR, sometimes better than some industry professionals do. So their vernacular is changing, and it's anecdotal to be sure, but they seem to just be, they're exposed to more of the vocabulary earlier on. So this next gen of devs and designers, they are kind of learning in some ways as the industry is learning, and they're getting actual degrees in this stuff. So it's exciting, it's interesting, but we've definitely noticed their expectations and their terminology change quite a lot.
Something I've noticed just even in the last year is that the students are coming. Usually my class is taught after they've gone through the psychology and the UX classes. I get them. And so it's interesting to see them evolve and come to me with questions that they're all, like at the beginning of this year, they were all like, I want to learn how to play test because I've already started doing it in my games. I'm like, oh, that's awesome. All right, come to me a little sooner maybe, because like by the end of your class, you're already using methods that maybe we should correct earlier. But it's really exciting to see them excited about learning how to hone things that they've already learned about. Maybe not in the depth of how you run a play test, but in terms of I have the basis now. Now my job is to actually hone that and and tune it so that they can use it in their classes and their game design process. And it helps make them better designers because now they're aware of how do I figure out what the audience thinks? How do I use this in my class? How do I use this when I bring this to demos and show it at like the game jams? How do I evaluate this and how do I use these methods? So it's been super exciting to see the students already come with a basis and not have to start at the beginning and be able to just dive right in and see them use it in their schooling and not just expect it to be a job at the end.
Like I said, I started 3 years ago, and when I would ask people at the beginning or the end of the class how many of them wanted to be UX designers, I would get maybe one hand out of my class. Now I get like 5 or 6 hands. Like we're getting a lot. I get all the freshmen design students, game design students at DigiPen. So I teach like 90 students a semester type situation. And so we're seeing a vast improvement of students interested in these subjects. And I always like feed them into like Jenn's class or feed them into these other classes so that we can have a brand new, excited, passionate, educated generation of UI UX people, because that just didn't exist back when we were in school. So
when I started 10 years ago, I think there were like 2 people who had backgrounds in psychology who were working at game studios, actually doing applied psychology. Now there are thousands, like actually thousands. So I guess the trend is that there's a lot more interest in kind of, I guess, understanding how knowledge from other disciplines can be applied to what we're doing in games. And so all of the, I guess, advice and noise I was saying about how we should be looking to other disciplines to help inform us, lots and lots of people are doing that. And so it's likely going to get harder to find the original or creative ideas because more and more people are aware of just how valuable it can be to draw on outside knowledge.
So I'm not sure where we are in terms of the Q&A. I don't know if we have any time, so please feel free to talk to us. Can you skip to the next slide that has our information on it?
Yeah.
I just started Twitter, and I don't know what I'm doing, so please help me out. Mike doesn't have a Twitter, but...
Yeah, I don't have a Twitter, but if you go to the Valve website, you can find my email. I'm always happy to chat about stuff.
Yeah.
I don't tweet. But we're about to have a break, so you can come talk to us then.
All right. Thank you for listening. We appreciate it.